Hello and welcome to this live and interactive web TV show. I'm Dr. Rob Hicks. Depression and mental illness have been taboo topics for years, but despite the fact that 1 in 4 of us will suffer from these conditions at some point in our life, we still find it hard to talk about them or even admit we may have them. Joining me today to help us recognise the signs of depression in both ourselves and in others is former registered mental health nurse and member of the Committee of Management, Frank Whitehouse, clinical lead from Turning Point's Wakefield Right Step Service, Lindsay Denton, and Neil Sellers, who suffered from post-traumatic stress disorder. Welcome to you all.
Thank you.
We are live today, so if you have any questions for our panel, please use the box on your screen, and we'll do our best to tackle them over the course of the next 15 minutes or so. So Lindsay, let me start with you. Education and campaigning has meant that attitudes have changed towards mental illness, but is it the case that we still struggle to talk about them?
I think we do, yeah. I think we sometimes feel we're on our own with it and we're worried about other people's perceptions, and we may have some perceptions of it ourselves as well. So I think that all sort of leads to us being reluctant really to kind of bring it out into the open and discuss it.
Frank, 1 in 4 of us will suffer from a mental health problem at some stage in our lives. It is really a very common problem, after all.
It is indeed. In fact, I often think that 1 in 4 is perhaps not a high enough proportion because many of us suffer from mood swings, even though they may be minor in comparison with what might be seen as a medical definition of depression. So most of us know what depression means, but I think that it's one of those conditions that strikes right across the whole spectrum of society. It doesn't respect age, it doesn't respect gender, it doesn't respect employment or any of the normal status issues that we govern ourselves by.
And what sort of people came to you with depression? And what were some of the common causes?
Well, amongst the most common causes, I think, were the kind of consistent pressures that people had been under. People can cope with a certain amount of pressure, but when it becomes consistent, when it becomes regular, there sometimes is a point where it's no longer something that we can reasonably cope with. And many of the pressures were societal pressures, pressures of employment, perhaps being overworked, perhaps being in the wrong sort of job, pressures of relationship, and that can stretch across child, adolescent, adult, retired person. Pressures also, I have to mention this one specifically, of finance. Often we don't think of finance as being a cause of a medical condition, but really if you haven't got enough money and you're struggling consistently to make things meet, that in itself is a very difficult situation.
Lindsay, what sort of symptoms did people bring to you, as a therapist, with their depression or with their other mental health problems?
I think what you often see is that lowered mood. Often people explain it as though it might be a dark cloud hanging over you. You feel more tired than usual. You might start to move a lot slower than usual. There could be changes to your appetite and your sleep as well. And generally there could be a lack of motivation and feeling a bit stuck sometimes. We'd usually see things like that.
So what about the range of symptoms, Frank, that somebody might... one of the problems with depression is that it can be very mild at one end of the spectrum. It can be very severe at the other. Describe for us, if you wouldn't mind, the sort of milder end of the spectrum.
Yeah. I think as already been mentioned by Lindsay, that sleeplessness or staying in bed for too long because there doesn't seem to be anything to get up for, those are certainly issues. Lack of appetite, feeling of isolation, feeling of loneliness, a feeling that even those things that would normally stimulate you, which would normally interest you, no longer have the same rationale whatsoever for interesting you. Those are amongst the most common of symptoms. But you can get also physical symptoms, and it'll differ from person to person. Some people might have great anxiety, which is often connected with depression. That can result in physical manifestations such as extreme perspiration, sometimes aches and pains in the joints, feeling not physically very well.
And that's how people can present at their GP sometimes with a physical problem, a headache that's reoccurring, or fatigue. and often the GP will find that there's some depression there.
So Neil, how did you find your experience dealing with depression? Because you suffered with depression.
Yeah, I mean, hearing that is very much where I was 2 years ago. But what finally, I knew there was something wrong with me. I knew I wasn't functioning normally. I would come into London on business and find myself sat in the tube and not entirely sure where I was going, or I'd be sat on the platform, not sure I should be going onto the tube or back to the railway station. And yeah, very, very strange mix of symptoms. And I absolutely knew there was something wrong, but I couldn't have named it as depression. So felt very fortunate. My GP spotted it quite quickly when I went to see her and sent me on to Turning Point.
How easy did you find it to talk about depression, or indeed accept that your diagnosis was depression?
I found it quite easy to talk to my GP about it, because that was almost a protected environment. But outside that room, really not at all. I mean, I found the Turning Point sessions really helpful, because I think I said at the time, it was like going to Alcoholics Anonymous, as I imagine it, but without saying, hi, I'm depressed. You could just sit with a bunch of a dozen or 15 other people who looked perfectly normal like I did and were suffering like I was. And the comfort of that was a lot of what helped me get through what I was going through.
Did you find that it was difficult for family and friends to talk about the subject with you or around you?
I think I disguised it very well. And of course, I don't know, because as you said, it is a great taboo. It's something people don't want to talk about. My wife was very helpful, and I had one friend I could talk to as well. But I think I managed to keep my symptoms hidden to that group, if you like. And to me, that kind of felt important that I had to do that. Like, it was the taboo, it wasn't well, blokes shouldn't feel like this, should they?
That's right.
I was talking to a friend last night and saying, of course, if you've broken your arm, nobody asks you why you've broken your arm, or says pull yourself together. If you stay feeling depressed, well, why are you depressed? What are you unhappy about? And of course, it's not unhappiness at all.
Absolutely. And we've got lots of questions coming in. I've got a question here from Kay. My mother is now living alone and seems to have lost all interest in many of the things that used to bring her pleasure, something you were mentioning earlier on, Lindsay. I think it's most probably depression. However, it's hard enough to encourage her to get out of the house, let alone to get her to acknowledge her depression and see, get counselling. What's a good first step in this situation?
I think there are things you can do at home. There's lots of self-help books and guides available. A lot of services now offer a telephone treatment because that sort of bridges that little gap, and once you get to know someone you might go and see them, or you might just remain on the telephone quite anonymously, which is fine. But it sounds in this case that, because we didn't mention about the causes, was adjustment. Sometimes when you find yourself in a new position, and it sounds like she's found herself living on her own quite recently, that's been the impact. So keep trying to do what she's doing, but there are lots of self-help guides.
So presumably support her mother, but also try and normalise it, that it's not her fault. This is a condition that can be treated, that, as we've already highlighted, so many people do experience. However, they successfully get treatment. So we've got another question here from Nikki. I often feel quite tearful when things are a bit much for me, even though they are often not big problems. Is this just stress, or is it a symptom of something more like depression? Frank?
I think that emotion and the expression of emotion, particularly tearfulness, can be a part of depression. It can be symptomatic of it, but it can also be quite cathartic as well, I think, so that if people allow themselves to cry, particularly males, I might add, who, within our culture are not conditioned to cry, and that's something that you don't do because it didn't stiff up a lip. In a quiet moment or in a quiet place, it may be quite a good therapy to cry, actually. So yes, it is a part and parcel of some forms of depression, and if you want to cry, cry. Yeah.
Coming back to Neil's point, why do we find it so difficult to talk about depression and mental health problems? Why do we feel we have to hold them inside?
I was interested in what Neil said about when you were lost on the tube, because I think what we didn't mention as well is that the criticism that you might give yourself. And why am I doing this? Why can't I just get on with it? And you begin to sort of criticise, am I letting people down? Am I feeling useless? And if you think that about you, what are other people going to think about you? And I think you get into that kind of mindset, and it's quite harmful to your mood.
Is there also a mindset that I should be able to deal with this?
Absolutely.
I should be able to...
It's coming from within me, so why can't I control this?
Certainly in some cases that will be so. If you've been used to difficult situations, perhaps in terms of your employment, you maybe have been in a position of some authority, for example, but there are also people who may be conditioned by their own cultural situation. We haven't mentioned ethnicity so far, but I've worked in areas where there are people from other parts of the world who've settled, and depression is far from realised within some communities because it has social values attached to it which are completely negative, perhaps in a rather heavier sense than even our own. So those sorts of feelings of low self-esteem are absolutely typical. But at the same time, I would mention that I know of a case where someone went to a GP, said what was wrong with them and looked for help, and the GP said to the person, well, centrally, what are you going to do about it? So people are there to help, but a lot of the impetus is there within the person to express themselves again and to regain the confidence that they did have.
Neil, you've explained very, very clearly how you felt. How did you hide your feelings from those around you?
I was working in a very controlled environment, so my job was quite high power but very fixed in what I was doing, and it was all about controlling different aspects of different things. So I could quite easily put a mask over the top of it. And it's when I went into the dark room or into the tube underground, out the way, out of sight, could almost sort of let a sigh of relief out and go, actually, that wasn't how I'm really feeling. And the crying, absolutely. Fantastic therapy. For me, anyway.
So actually, what you're saying, all three of you, is let it out. Speak to somebody.
It's going to come out some way.
Yeah.
So let it come out in a controlled way rather than in an uncontrolled way.
And there is a sense, if I can add this, Rob, people sometimes feel that anger which has been repressed is also a trigger to depression. So different people will have different triggers to their condition. If that anger can somehow be expressed, maybe in physical activity, for example, then that also can be quite a therapeutic thing.
What do people do? What can they do to avoid depression?
I think know your stressors, know your limitations, have a very realistic view of what you can achieve as a human and what other balls you've got in the air and you're trying to juggle, and things like, sleep well, plenty of rest and relaxation, do things you enjoy, get out and mingle with people, and diet and exercise, as we've said, exercise is really good at using some of that energy and getting you out there.
And if you can, and particularly for carers, if it's possible to get somebody to a show, more often than so, I'm going to a Ken Dodd show soon. I shall probably finish up in tears because it's so funny. But if laughter itself is a tremendous therapy, and the socialising that comes with that. The first questioner said, well, what should she do? I would suggest, if there's a possibility of taking somebody to a show, particularly to a comedy show, take the person.
Fantastic. We've got another question here from Betty. She says, I'm reluctant to take medication. Is there anything else you recommend?
Yeah, absolutely. The National Institute of Clinical Excellence actually recommends psychological therapy and or medication. So you can do both or either. So absolutely, there's lots of therapies around for depression, cognitive behavioural therapy being probably the most accessible one, but you've also got interpersonal therapy and counselling for depression. So definitely there's an alternative.
And a question from Linda. I've suffered with depression since childhood and only recently, at the age of 50, spoke to my GP about it. I had an adverse reaction to the prescribed medication, so I've decided to use self-help books.
Brilliant.
I spend at least 1 hour each week studying the books and I'm feeling slightly better, but realise it's going to take a while. Should I explain to my line manager? I always try to keep it under control at work.
That's an interesting one, isn't it? I think the judgment on that can only, putting the question back to the questioner, can only be dependent on the circumstances that the questioner feels comfortable with. If you've got a sympathetic boss, that might be fine. But if you've got a boss who thinks that you should just pull yourself together and snap out of it, it might not be a good idea.
I think, interestingly, Frank, it's the latter type of boss that actually needs the education.
Yes, indeed.
Isn't it?
Yes.
I mean, we can consider it's an illness like any other, so they should be managing it like any if you had the flu or an ongoing back complaint. But also, we're both looking at a company and see whether they do have an occupational health service or a counselling service that they buy into, because lots of employers do now.
Yeah.
And George says, do you think people too easily self-diagnose themselves as depressed, making it harder for people really suffering with depression to be taken seriously? I guess this is the sort of man flu type equivalent, isn't it? Isn't it really?
I guess it manifests itself in so many different ways. Yeah. And even a very mild depression, I consider a very mild depression, can be pretty ruinous to your daily life. So I don't think you can even treat a mild depression as something that's actually putting everybody else off, and equally needs the attention to either be rid of it or manage it or stop it becoming something a lot worse.
There are people who maybe go to see their GP, maybe have medication. I can think of one quite recently who then decided that he wasn't going to allow himself to be reliant on medication, and so he took himself off it. He still struggled, but I mean, as this lady is saying now, she's obviously contended with it very successfully for a long time. It may have diminished some of her life opportunities, but you know, she needs a medal for what she's done so far. So some people can cope to some extent with it, and it may be in some cases you might have to live with the consequences if you decide to go down a certain path.
I think it's important to highlight, with regards coming off medication, you do it in a supervised way.
Absolutely.
Under the guidance
Gradually.
of your therapist or your doctor, and do it gradually.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So let me ask, before we go, what advice would each of you give to people who think that they may be suffering with depression, or in fact know somebody who's suffering with depression? Frank, let's start with you.
Can I deal with the second one? People who feel they may know one who's suffering from depression. I would say use encouragement, use sympathy, be supportive, but don't take all opportunity away from the person to help themselves. Be very patient and try to be understanding, and look after yourself. You've mentioned, Neil, about your wife being in a position to care for you. It can be a stress on carers also.
Lindsay, your advice?
I think talk to somebody. I mean, there's lots of things available now that you can help yourself with, that, like the lady earlier, with the self-help guides and lots of programs on the internet that you can use. There's even apps on your phone now. So I think that if you don't feel you can talk to something, do something. But if you can talk to someone, good place is always your GP, but there are so many places taking self-referral now. If you really think you can't do that, you can go beyond your GP.
And Neil, as somebody who's successfully tackled and overcome depression, what would your advice be?
I think don't underestimate what some very small changes can make to you. So, for example, I stopped cycling to work and started walking to work, and just the ability to walk in a relaxed way and look at what was around was a lot less stressful than riding through traffic, and started and ended my day in a much more relaxing way.
Well, sadly, we've run out of time. We've covered some excellent ground here today. My thanks to Frank Whitehouse, Lindsay Denton and Neil Sellers for joining us. Now, if you'd like to continue with your questions and thoughts related to dealing with depression, why not join your Benenden Health online community at the address on your screen now. That's secure.benenden.co.uk/suite/apps. Click on the community tab to share and discuss with other Benenden Health members. Now, thanks for watching and for all your questions. Bye-bye for now.